It was on a random Tuesday night that I got the first hint something was off. I'm usually a laid-back guy, not the type to snoop or get suspicious, but this wasn't the usual vibe. Natalie was sitting across from me at dinner, a little smile on her face that just didn't match up with reality. We weren't even talking. She was just scrolling through her phone, chuckling to herself while her plate went cold. I asked her what was so funny. Without looking up, she said, "Oh, just a meme," and flipped her phone over, face down on the table. But I caught a quick flash of a name on her screen before she did. Zach. Who the hell was Zach? Normally, I'd brush it off. She had coworkers, friends from her gym class, random contacts I didn't know about. But this time, something about her reaction felt off. She looked up, saw me staring, and actually laughed. "Jealous, babe? It's work stuff," she said, almost tauntingly, like she knew exactly how to keep me from digging deeper. Then she leaned over, gave me a quick peck on the cheek, and went back to her phone, smirking, and nagged at me all night. I didn't like this weird, dismissive look she'd given me, but I let it go. I was already exhausted from a long day at work, and the last thing I needed was to start a pointless argument that would keep us both up until morning. The next night, though, was the real kicker. I woke up around 2 in the morning, thirsty. On my way to the kitchen, I noticed her phone screen light up in the dark. She'd gotten a message, and in my half-asleep state, I barely glanced at it, until I saw it was from that same Zach. I leaned in a bit to see the preview. "Missed seeing you tonight. You left your scarf at my place." My heart dropped. The words practically echoed in my head as I stood there, replaying her stories from earlier. She told me she was meeting Amy from work after the gym and would be home late. Not exactly a night that ends with you leaving a scarf behind, right? I didn't confront her right away. I wanted more. I wanted to know just how far this had gone. So I started paying more attention, watching every detail. It was like seeing her through a completely different lens. She'd get home late, throw her coat on the chair, and leave her phone in the other room. She'd smile too easily, laugh too lightly. All the affection felt thin, like a mask she'd put on just because she had to. Then, this past Friday, I decided to test her. I told her I'd be working late on a big project, that I'd probably sleep in the office to get a head start on things. She barely hesitated before saying, "Good luck with that, babe." She didn't even ask any questions, didn't suggest waiting up for me, just shrugged it off. I left the house, went to a friend's place, and waited. A couple of hours later, I drove back, parked a block away, and walked to our house. All the lights were off. She wasn't home. I checked the GPS tracker app I downloaded just to test a theory. Her phone pinged at a bar downtown, a spot we'd been to together a handful of times. It wasn't exactly girls' night territory. I went in. It was dark, the sort of place you'd choose if you wanted to disappear. At the back, in one of those dim booths, I saw her, sitting way too close to a guy I'd never seen in my life. His hand was on her leg, and she was leaning in like she'd done it 100 times before. I watched her laugh at something he said, then lean even closer. In the dim light, I saw their faces tilt together. Her lips met his for a brief, careless kiss. I didn't approach. I didn't scream or shout. I took a letter I'd written, sealed in an envelope with her name on it, and placed it on the table nearby, where she'd find it when she was done with her fun. I walked out of that bar in a daze, feeling like I just stepped out of someone else's life. The air was cold, sharp against my skin, but my mind was numb. I kept replaying that kiss over and over, seeing her face lit up with this intensity one hadn't seen in ages. I don't know how long I stood there outside the bar, but finally, I dragged myself back to my car, gripping the steering wheel as if it was the only thing grounding me. Back at the house, everything looked the same as it always did. Our photos lined the walls, smiling and happy, as if nothing had changed. There was a half-empty cup of coffee on the kitchen counter, her favorite scarf hanging by the door, and our shoes lined up side by side. But now, every little thing felt like a lie. I knew she'd be home eventually, and the letter, well, I'd left enough in there to make it clear that I'd seen everything. I told her I knew she was lying. I told her I'd watched her break my trust in that bar, and if she wanted to be with this other guy, she needed to tell me to my face. I'd kept it as calm as I could, but there was no mistaking the message. She was caught, and I was done waiting for explanations. It was nearly 3 in the morning when I heard the front door click open. She was trying to be quiet, probably thinking I was asleep, probably planning how she'd sneak into bed and act as if everything was normal in the morning. But when she came into our room and saw me sitting there, just watching her, her whole face froze. "Hey," she stammered, putting on this little guilty smile, like she'd just been out past curfew or something. She didn't know about the letter yet. She'd come straight up to the bedroom. "What are you doing up?" I didn't answer. I just held up my phone and pressed play on a voice memo I'd recorded while I was standing outside the bar. It was nothing but the sound of her laughing, her voice drifting out of that place, followed by that one line I'd heard her say just before I'd turned and left. "I can't wait to get out of here with you." Her face dropped. She didn't even try to deny it. She just stood there, frozen, trying to figure out what to say. For a second, I saw this flash of fear in her eyes, and I almost felt sorry for her. Almost. "So, Zach," I finally said, breaking the silence. Her eyes darted to the floor, and she started fumbling, reaching for any excuse she could pull together. "Okay, it's not what it looks like," she said, stumbling over her words, trying to keep that fake innocence plastered across her face. "We're just friends. We were just talking. You know how work gets, it's also intense. He's just someone I can unwind with." "Unwind," I repeated, holding back a laugh. "Since when does unwinding involve leaving your scarf at his place?" She flinched. She knew she was caught, and suddenly that soft, guilty look in her eyes turned cold. "Maybe if you were actually around, I wouldn't need to unwind with someone else," she shot back, her tone sharp, almost like she was daring me to say something. My stomach twisted. There it was, the blame game, the shifting of responsibility. I wanted to yell, to make her see just how twisted and wrong this all was. But I just kept my voice calm, almost too calm, and said, "Is that really how you want to play this? Because if that's what you're going for, I've got all night." She stared at me for a long second, her expression shifting from guilt to annoyance, like I was the one in the wrong for not letting this go. She finally muttered, "You're being dramatic. This whole thing, it's nothing. Just a fling. It doesn't mean anything. Nothing. Just a fling." Those words hit me harder than I expected. Because if that's how easily she could dismiss this, then what did that make us? Her words hung in the air, sharp and stinging. Just a fling. It doesn't mean anything. She said it like she was commenting on the weather. Like our life together, everything we'd built, was worth nothing more than a shrug. "Just a fling?" I repeated slowly, watching her expression, trying to find some hint of remorse, maybe a flicker of regret. But all I got was a blank stare, like she'd already detached from this conversation, and, probably, from me. I could almost see the walls going up behind her eyes, the calculation as she sized me up, probably deciding just how much more she had to lie to get out of this. But I wasn't letting her slip out of this one so easily. "Tell me something," I said, trying to keep my voice steady, though I could feel it tightening with anger. "How long has this been going on, Natalie?" She rolled her eyes, a bitter smile pulling at her lips, like I was boring her. "Oh, stop, Liam. You're making this into some big drama. It was a couple of nights out. That's it. Zach, he's just someone to talk to. You're overreacting." Overreacting. I almost laughed. "You think watching my wife kiss another man in a bar, finding out she's been lying to me, hiding things, that's just me overreacting? Well, what do you want me to say?" She snapped, finally breaking out of her calm act. "Maybe if you weren't so obsessed with work all the time, I wouldn't have needed to find someone who actually paid attention to me." I stared at her, feeling like I was looking at a stranger. "So this is my fault?" "Maybe it is," she shouted, throwing her hands up. "You've been so checked out for months. Liam, you come home, you barely even talk to me, and when I do try to connect, you're always tired or busy with something. Do you even know how lonely I've been?" Her words hit me, but I wasn't buying it. "Lonely?" I shot back. "So what, you don't talk to me about it, don't tell me you're unhappy, you just find someone else to fill the gaps? And I'm supposed to understand?" She folded her arms, her expression hardening. "You wouldn't understand even if I tried. You're not interested in fixing things, are you? You just want to play the victim here." It was like a switch flipped inside her, and any trace of guilt or apology vanished. She started pacing around the room, throwing out accusations, twisting the narrative, making this somehow about everything I'd done wrong. She wasn't apologizing. She wasn't even pretending to regret it. She was rewriting the story, making me the villain in some bizarre drama where she was the poor, neglected wife, forced to find comfort elsewhere. I sat down, trying to process the storm of accusations she was hurling my way. Suddenly, it was my fault she'd been driven to this. My fault that she'd lied and snuck around behind my back. In her mind, this wasn't a betrayal. It was a cry for help. She almost seemed smug, like she'd found the perfect justification for her actions. But I'd had enough. "Stop," I said quietly, cutting through her rant. "You don't get to stand there and blame this all on me, Natalie. I'm done listening to you twist this around." She glared at me, and for a second, I saw something fierce in her eyes, like she was angry that I wasn't folding under the weight of her words. But I kept going, my voice low, steady. "I'm willing to take my share of the blame for our problems. Fine. I'll admit I've been working more. Maybe I haven't been as present as I could have been. But none of that gives you an excuse to cheat, to lie, to go behind my back like this." For the first time, she seemed to hesitate. A flicker of uncertainty crossed her face, but she buried it quickly, her lips pressing into a tight line. "You just don't get it?" she muttered, almost to herself, like she was talking to someone who wasn't even in the room. Then she turned, headed for the door. "Where are you going?" I asked, standing up. She didn't even look back. "To clear my head. You're impossible right now." And then she was gone, the door slamming shut behind her. I stood there in the silence she left behind, listening to her footsteps fade, feeling the weight of her words settle in. She wasn't sorry. She wasn't even close to sorry. She'd flipped the script, twisted the blame, and stormed out without a single shred of accountability. I could feel my anger simmering, building with every second that passed. Because in that moment, I realized something that I hadn't before. Natalie wasn't the woman I thought she was, and maybe she never had been. I didn't sleep that night. After she left, I sat there in the silence of our house, the anger morphing into something colder, sharper, something that demanded action. She turned this entire situation on me, twisted every lie, every betrayal into some desperate plea for my attention, and then just walked out like she was the one who'd been wronged. That was the moment I knew I couldn't just let this slide. If she was going to play games, then I'd make sure she'd remember who she was playing against. In the morning, Natalie came back just before sunrise, her eyes red and exhausted. I could tell she expected a fight, maybe even some kind of apology on my part. But I didn't give her either. I acted calm, distant, civil. I didn't demand explanations or push her to talk about her night out. I think that threw her off more than any argument would have. I could see her watching me, waiting for me to snap or beg her to work things out. But I didn't. I just went through the motions. Drank my coffee, read the paper, even made her breakfast without saying a word about what had happened. She didn't bring it up either. I guess she thought her silence meant control, that if she didn't acknowledge what she'd done, she could pretend it wasn't a big deal. It was strange, like we'd both agreed to step into some twisted version of normal, ignoring the reality we both knew was hanging in the air between us. That whole day, I went through my routine as if nothing was wrong, as if I wasn't replaying every moment of her betrayal in my head. But beneath the calm, I was planning. I wanted her to feel even a fraction of the confusion, the helplessness she'd put me through. So, I decided to start with the same subtle tricks she'd used on me. I began going out late without explaining myself, answering her questions with half-truths, like, just seeing some old friends. I'd linger on my phone longer than usual, drop hints that I was messaging people she didn't know, and then lock the screen whenever she glanced over. I could feel her starting to shift, the balance of power tilting. And the best part? She didn't know if she had a right to ask, because asking would mean acknowledging her own lies. One evening, a few days later, I made sure to come home well after midnight. I'd ignored her texts all evening, just like she'd done to me so many times. When I finally walked through the door, she was waiting up for me in the living room, her arms crossed, jaw tight. "Where have you been?" she demanded, her voice low and controlled, like she was trying to hold back a storm. "Out," I said simply, pulling off my jacket and setting it on the couch. I didn't offer anything more, didn't try to soothe her worries, just stared at her, letting the silence stretch. Her eyes narrowed. With who? The question hung there, and I could almost feel her discomfort rising, as if my calm, detached reaction was a reminder of her own betrayal. Does it matter? I replied, my tone cold. After all, it's not like we have to share everything, right? Her face paled slightly, and she clenched her fists, obviously not prepared for the shift in attitude. She looked like she was about to say something, to push for answers, but then thought better of it. Instead, she just nodded stiffly and muttered, Fine, I don't care anyway. But she did care. I could see it every time I walked out the door without saying where I was going. Every time I caught her glancing at my phone out of the corner of her eye. She'd started keeping tabs on me, doing these little things that showed she was unraveling just a bit. And the more she tried to ignore it, the more obvious it became. A week later, I left for another late night out. But this time, I dropped one more hint, just a casual remark as I grabbed my coat. Don't wait up, I might be seeing someone. I watched her face, saw the shock ripple across her features before she could hide it. She didn't say anything, but her lips tightened, and she gave a curt nod as if she didn't care. But I knew better. That night, I stayed out late again, and when I came home, I found her waiting for me in the kitchen. She looked tense, a slight tremor in her hands as she held a glass of water. Who is she? She finally blurted out, the mask of indifference finally cracking. Who's who? I replied calmly, feigning confusion, which only seemed to fuel her frustration. This person you're seeing, she spat out. Her voice was sharper, angrier. What are you trying to prove, Liam? That you can hurt me too? For a second, I considered telling her the truth, about how this whole thing was just a mirror, a reflection of her own actions. But I held back, letting the weight of her accusations settle between us. Maybe, I said slowly, my voice steady. Or maybe I just don't owe you answers anymore. The look in her eyes changed, something flashing there that almost looked like regret, but it was too late for that. I watched her wrestle with the words she wanted to say, but this time, she couldn't twist the story to make me the villain. This time, she was the one without control. And for the first time in weeks, I saw a crack in her confidence. A glimpse of the realization dawning on her, that maybe, just maybe, she'd started a game she wasn't prepared to finish. After that night, things between us took on an eerie calm. Natalie started doing everything she could to pull me back. Little gestures that, a month ago, would have meant the world to me. She'd cook my favorite meals, ask about my day, even tried to watch some of those old shows we used to binge together. But none of it mattered now because I'd already seen the real her. And I knew that every move she made, every careful smile, every I love you whispered at night, it was all a weak attempt to cover the cracks she'd made herself. One evening, about a week after our last confrontation, she decided to push things further. She approached me as I was getting ready to go out again, the scent of her perfume filling the room. She leaned against the doorframe, arms folded, a calculated look in her eyes. I want to talk, she said firmly, as if she'd finally decided that tonight would be the night we'd clear the air. I looked at her, raised an eyebrow and just said, Go ahead. She hesitated, glancing at the floor before meeting my gaze again. Look, Liam, I know things have been complicated between us, and maybe I haven't been fair to you. I know I've made mistakes, but I don't want to lose you over something stupid. Her voice softened, and for a split second, I almost believed her. But there was something in her eyes, something guarded, as if she was still choosing her words carefully, still holding back the truth. You don't want to lose me? I asked, my voice flat. Or do you just not want to lose the comfort of having someone who's always there for you, no matter what? Her expression tightened, like she'd been slapped. That's not fair, Liam. Care about you. I've always cared about you. But things got confusing, okay? Zach was just a distraction. A mistake. One that I know I shouldn't have made. A distraction, I repeated, letting the word hang in the air. So what, you're telling me he was some phase? That you only did it because you were confused? Yes, she said quickly, relief flickering across her face as if she thought I'd finally understood her. I wasn't thinking straight. I let things get out of hand and it's my fault. But if you can just let it go, we can move past this. Start fresh. I laughed. A cold sound that surprised even me. Start fresh. I shook my head. Natalie, do you even hear yourself? You spent weeks lying to my face, sneaking around, blaming me for your decisions. And now you just expect me to forget all of that because you're sorry? You think a few apologies erase what you did? She stepped closer, reaching for my hand, her eyes pleading. Liam, please. I love you. I know I messed up, but you can't seriously believe that one mistake defines everything we have together. One mistake. I pulled my hand back, the anger building up until it practically burned. Natalie, you don't even know the half of it. The words came out before I'd even realized I'd said them. She looked at me, her eyes widening, suspicion darkening her expression. What's that supposed to mean? For a moment, I was silent, debating if I should reveal everything I'd pieced together about her lies. The late nights, the messages she thought she'd hidden so well. I almost wanted her to feel the weight of every step she'd taken in this game she thought she'd mastered. But instead, I took a breath, leaned in close enough to see the tension in her face, and said, "It means that maybe you weren't the only one who decided to unwind somewhere else." Her face blanched, and she stumbled back slightly, her mouth opening and closing as she struggled to process my words. I didn't elaborate. I just let the seed of doubt take root, twisting her confidence the same way she'd twisted mine. She tried to cover up her shock, to throw back some cold retort, but her voice faltered. You wouldn't. You're just saying that to get under my skin." "Am I?" I replied, tilting my head, giving her a small, knowing smile. "Or maybe I just finally realized that if you could go off and find someone new so easily, maybe I could too." She looked like she'd been punched. For the first time since all this had started, she was the one who looked genuinely hurt, as if the reality of her actions was finally hitting her. She opened her mouth as if to argue, to defend herself, but no words came out. And then, just as quickly as that hurt had flashed in her eyes, it was replaced by something else. A cold, calculating anger. She straightened, narrowing her gaze at me. "So that's what this has been about? Getting even?" "No, Natalie," I replied calmly. "This isn't about revenge. This is about finally letting you see that you don't get to decide what's real and what's not. You lost that right the moment you lied to my face." She glared at me, biting her lip, trying to keep her emotions in check. But I could see her wavering. All the control she'd thought she had, the power she'd thought she held over me, it was crumbling. And for the first time, she was the one left with the questions, the uncertainties. Without another word, I turned, grabbed my keys and walked out the door. This time, I didn't say where I was going, didn't give her any hint or comfort. I left her in that quiet, empty house, alone with the weight of her own betrayal, just as she'd left me all those nights. And as I stepped outside into the cool night air, I felt something lift. She'd always thought she was the one in control, the one calling the shots. But now, she was finally seeing what it felt like to be left in the dark, that I didn't come home that night. I didn't even check my phone to see if she tried calling or texting. I left it on silent in my jacket pocket, fully content to let her stew in her own questions. I stayed with my friend Jake instead, a guy who'd known me long before I'd met Natalie. The one person I knew wouldn't sugarcoat things or tell me what I wanted to hear. I needed someone real, someone who'd look at me and tell me whether I was out of line or finally waking up to the truth. When I showed up at his door, Jake didn't even hesitate. He just opened up, took one look at my face, and muttered, "Come in. You look like you've been through hell." Inside, I finally told him everything. Every detail. Every lie I'd uncovered. Every time Natalie had brushed me off. The bar, the letter, the accusations she'd thrown back at me. And I told him about the way I turned the tables, dropped hints that I was seeing someone, how it had rattled her in a way I hadn't expected. Jake listened without interrupting, his face shifting from anger to disbelief as I spoke. When I finished, he leaned back, folding his arms with a sigh. "Damn, man. I knew she was a handful, but this..." He shook his head. "So what now?" That was the question, wasn't it? What now? Part of me wanted to keep up the game, to keep Natalie in that state of wondering, just so she'd feel some fraction of the pain she'd put me through. But there was another part, a quiet voice I hadn't listened to yet, telling me it was time to be done with this entire mess. That by keeping her hanging, I was only holding on to something that was already dead. Jake must have seen my hesitation because he didn't press me. Instead, he just said, "Look, if you're asking me, you don't owe her a single explanation. She made her choice, right? And you've done enough waiting around, trying to make sense of it." He was right. As much as I wanted to unravel every excuse she'd given, every lie she'd told, I realized then that it wouldn't change anything. The trust was gone. Whatever she'd been to me was over, replaced by someone who'd taken my faith and twisted it into something unrecognizable. But ending things, really ending them, meant I'd have to face her, confront her one last time, make it clear that there was no more game left to play. The next morning, I got back home early, determined to make this as clean as possible. I had already planned out what I'd say, how I'd lay out the facts, get her to understand that this wasn't a conversation or an argument anymore. It was the end. When I walked in, Natalie was sitting at the kitchen table, eyes red and puffy like she hadn't slept at all. She looked up the moment she heard the door open, relief flickering across her face before it vanished into something more guarded. "You're back," she said quietly, like she was treading carefully. I just nodded, walking over to sit across from her. She watched me, searching my face, probably for any sign of forgiveness, any hint that she could still smooth this over. I didn't give her that chance. "Natalie," I started, keeping my voice steady, "I came back here to make this clear once and for all. We're done. There's nothing left to fix, no more pretending. Whatever trust we had, you destroyed it. And I'm not going to stand here and let you blame me for what you chose to do." She stared at me, shock flashing across her face. "Wait, Liam, you're not thinking this through. We can work on this. We've been through so much. Don't just throw it away because of one mistake." "One mistake?" I let out a humorless laugh. "That's the story you're sticking with? A mistake is a lie that slips out once, not months of sneaking around, lying to my face, letting someone else into a part of your life that was supposed to be ours." She reached across the table, desperation in her eyes. "I know I messed up, Liam, but we can rebuild. You can't tell me you're just ready to walk away like this. Think of everything we've been through, everything we could still have." I pulled my hand back, my jaw clenching. "What we had, Natalie, is gone. Because you decided it was worth risking for some distraction. Some fling that didn't mean anything, remember?" She opened her mouth to respond, but I saw it. The realization that her excuses weren't working, that the script she'd memorized wasn't going to save her this time. I could see her struggling, her mind racing for any last-ditch effort to pull me back in. But she was out of options, out of chances. "Liam, please," she whispered, her voice cracking. I'll do anything to make this right. Just don't leave. You don't have to do this." I looked at her, and for the first time I felt nothing. No anger, no betrayal. Just a numb acceptance that this part of my life was over. "You already left, Natalie. The moment you decided to be with someone else, you ended this. I'm just finishing what you started." The silence that followed was heavy, final. She didn't argue anymore, didn't try to reach for me or plead. She just sat there, her face pale, as if she was only now understanding what she'd lost. I stood up, grabbed my coat, and headed for the door, knowing that whatever lay ahead was better than holding onto the broken pieces she'd left behind. As I walked out of that house for the last time, I felt something shift, something close. I wasn't looking back. Not this time. And with each step, I could feel the weight lifting, the future opening up, finally free from the lies and the shadows of what we used to be. Leaving that house felt like shedding a skin. I didn't even look back as I walked down the driveway and got into my car. The road stretched ahead, open and empty in the early morning light, and for the first time in a long time, I felt a strange sense of peace, like a clean, quiet slate. I ended up at a coffee shop downtown, one of those quiet places with warm lighting and the smell of fresh bread hanging in the air. I sat there with a cup of coffee, my hands wrapped around it as if the warmth could somehow ground me, remind me that this was real. I'd finally done it. I'd walked away from everything I thought my life was supposed to be, from the woman I thought I'd grow old with. It should have hurt more, maybe, but all I felt was relief. I spent hours in that shop, thinking about everything that had happened. All the little signs I'd ignored. All the red flags I'd brushed aside. Hindsight was brutal. Looking back, it felt like the clues were everywhere. Like Natalie had never really tried to hide what she was doing. She just counted on me not seeing it. On me trusting her too much to even consider that she'd betray me. Then came the messages. I hadn't checked my phone all morning, but when I finally did, I found dozens of texts from her. Long paragraphs, desperate pleas, followed by shorter, sharper messages when I hadn't responded. She'd swung from apology to blame, back and forth, trying every approach she could think of. Liam, please come back. We can talk this out. I know I messed up, but are you really just going to walk away like this? After everything we've been through? Fine. If this is what you want, if you think you're better off without me, then go ahead. But don't pretend you're any better than I am. I read each one, my stomach twisting a little as I watched her words shift from regret to anger and back again. It was like she was going through every stage of grief, trying to find some way to hook me back in. But each message only made it clearer. She still didn't understand. This wasn't about her being caught or about me getting revenge. It was about finally seeing her for who she really was. And then, in the middle of those texts, another message popped up, this time from a number I didn't recognize. It was just one sentence. I'm sorry you had to find out this way. She told me you knew. I stared at the message, my mind racing. She told him I knew? That wasn't something Natalie would do. It would mean admitting she'd been caught, breaking her perfect narrative of control. My fingers hovered over the screen, hesitant, but finally, I typed back a simple response. Who is this? The reply came quickly. Zach. A mix of anger and curiosity surged through me. Zach, the guy she'd chosen. The guy who'd been sitting in that bar with her while I stood outside, watching everything unravel. For a moment, I considered ignoring him, deleting the message and putting it all behind me. But a part of me wanted answers. Some final closure to the mess she'd created. What do you want? I typed, keeping my message short, detached. There was a pause before he replied. Nothing. I just wanted to tell you I'm sorry. I didn't know she was married at first. It was strange, this sense of camaraderie, almost with the guy who'd been part of wrecking my marriage. I could tell from his tone that he was being honest. And in a twisted way, I almost respected him for reaching out, for not hiding behind Natalie's lies. When did you find out? I asked, more out of curiosity than anything else. A couple of months ago, he replied. She told me it was complicated, that you two were practically over but hadn't officially ended things. I believed her, stupid as it sounds. I clenched my jaw, feeling a bitter kind of vindication. So that was the story she'd fed him, that we were just hanging by a thread, that she was practically free, only a formality away from being single. And of course, he'd believed her. She was good at that, turning on the charm, making people see only what she wanted them to see. Well, you know the truth now, I replied. We weren't practically over. She lied to both of us. The next message came slowly, almost hesitant. I broke things off with her a few days ago. I couldn't keep going along with it. I just thought you should know. That stopped me in my tracks. She'd been dumped by the guy she risked everything for, probably right around the time she tried to play me with her apologies and half-hearted confessions. A strange sense of justice settled over me, like karma had finally caught up with her in ways I hadn't even planned for. Thanks. I typed back simply, and left it at that. I put my phone down, staring out the window at the world moving outside, people hurrying along the sidewalks, going about their days, oblivious to everything I'd just gone through. In a strange way, that message from Zach was the final piece I needed. The entire story was clear now. The lies, the manipulation, the selfishness that she'd never even tried to hide. With a deep breath, I paid for my coffee, grabbed my coat, and walked out of that cafe, leaving the texts, the messages, the entire mess in the past. I was done. For the first time, I knew that I was finally truly free of her. And with every step, I felt lighter, ready to rebuild my life from scratch, far away from the wreckage she'd left behind a week past. It was strange, settling into a life that didn't revolve around Natalie's moods, her lies, her constant presence. My days felt quieter, clearer. I kept myself busy, spent more time with friends, threw myself into work, Even picked up some hobbies I'd neglected over the years. It was like I was rediscovering pieces of myself that I'd let fall away, bit by bit, in my effort to keep her happy. Then, one evening, just as I'd started unwinding with a book and a glass of whiskey, there was a knock at my door. I wasn't expecting anyone, and a small part of me wondered if it was Jake, stopping by to check in. But when I opened the door, my stomach dropped. There she was, Natalie. She looked disheveled, tired, with dark circles under her eyes that even her makeup couldn't fully hide. For a second, neither of us said anything. She just stood there, biting her lip, glancing around like she wasn't sure she'd come to the right place. "Liam," she said finally, her voice barely above a whisper. "Can I come in?" My first instinct was to say no, to shut the door right in her face. But something stopped me. Maybe it was the look in her eyes, or maybe I just wanted to hear what she could possibly have left to say. I stepped back, wordlessly letting her inside. She walked in slowly, taking in the place, probably noting the subtle changes, the little signs that I was already moving on. Once she was inside, I crossed my arms and leaned against the wall, keeping my distance. "What do you want, Natalie?" She looked down, taking a shaky breath before meeting my eyes. I wanted to talk, just to explain." I let out a bitter laugh. "Explain? Haven't we been through enough of that already? I thought I'd made it clear there's nothing left to explain." She winced at my tone but didn't look away. "I know, Liam, but I can't. I can't just let this end without you understanding my side. I messed up. I know I did. But I need you to know that I never meant for it to go this far." I took a deep breath, forcing myself to stay calm. "You never meant for it to go this far? Natalie, you didn't just slip up once. You made choice after choice. You lied, you sneaked around, and then you had the nerve to act like this was all my fault. You don't get to come here and make yourself the victim now." Her eyes filled with tears, and for a moment, she looked genuinely remorseful. "I know, Liam. I know I don't deserve your forgiveness, but I can't stop thinking about what we had, everything we shared. I miss you. I miss us. I know you hate me right now, but—" Her voice cracked, and she took a shaky breath. "I don't think I'll ever feel that way about anyone else." I looked at her, the weight of her words sinking in. There was a time, God, so many times, when hearing her say those things would have pulled me right back, would have made me feel like maybe there was something worth saving. But now it felt empty, forced, like she was saying what she thought would make me stay. Not because it was true. "Natalie," I said quietly, "I don't hate you, but I don't love you anymore either." Her face paled, and she took a step back, her shoulders slumping. "You don't mean that." I shrugged, feeling the last bit of anger drain from me, replaced by a calm acceptance. "I do. I meant it when I said it was over. And you know what? I think you knew that too. That's why you came here, isn't it? Because you couldn't stand the idea of me moving on without you." She flinched, the words hitting her harder than I expected. I could see the realization sinking in, her understanding that she'd lost me for good. And maybe, for the first time, she saw what she'd really done, not just to me but to herself. For a moment, we stood there in silence, just two strangers who'd once shared a life, now separated by an ocean of broken trust and regret. She wiped her eyes, nodding slightly, accepting what she couldn't change. "I guess I was hoping—" She trailed off, her voice small and defeated. "But you're right. I didn't think this through. I just didn't want to believe it was really over." I nodded, not unkindly. "It is, Natalie. It's been over for a long time. We were just both too afraid to face it." She didn't argue, didn't try to fight it anymore. Instead, she gave me one last, lingering look, as if memorizing my face, then turned and walked to the door. She paused, her hand on the handle, and whispered, "Goodbye, Liam. Goodbye, Natalie." And with that, she was gone, leaving me standing alone in the quiet of my home. I'd expected to feel something, sadness, relief, maybe even regret. But all I felt was a sense of calm finality, like the last page of a book closing, allowing a new one to begin. And for the first time in months, I knew I was ready to turn that page. In the days that followed, I found myself adjusting to a new rhythm, one where Natalie didn't occupy any space in my thoughts. It felt surreal, like I was finally waking up from a long, exhausting dream. The weight of our past was gone, and in its place was a clarity I hadn't felt in years. I poured myself into work, reconnected with friends, and even started going to the gym more regularly. Little by little, I was rebuilding. Then, a surprising thing happened. I started seeing things differently. All the small, seemingly insignificant parts of my life took on a new meaning. I noticed the things I'd let slip during my years with Natalie, the friendships I'd let go of, the family gatherings I'd skipped because she didn't want to go, the hobbies I'd abandoned just to keep up with her social calendar. It was as if every sacrifice I'd made for her came flooding back, each one a reminder of how much of myself I'd lost trying to hold onto something that was already gone. One afternoon, as I was clearing out some old boxes in the closet, I found a stack of photos from before Natalie and I had ever met. There I was, grinning with my old college friends, hiking in the mountains, celebrating birthdays and road trips with people who knew me before I'd ever shaped myself to fit someone else's expectations. Looking at those pictures, I felt a strange mixture of nostalgia and anger. I'd traded so much of that freedom, that joy, just to make a relationship work that was never balanced to begin with. As the weeks went by, I focused on reconnecting with the people who had always been there, people I'd taken for granted. I met up with Jake more often, went hiking with an old college buddy, even caught up with my sister who'd been gently nudging me to visit for years. Each of them welcomed me back without a hint of resentment, even though I knew I hadn't been there for them as much as they'd been there for me. My sister especially didn't hold back. She'd always been a realist, unafraid to tell me the truth even when I didn't want to hear it. One night, as we sat on her back porch, she looked over at me with a small smile and said, "You know, I've been waiting for this version of you to come back." I raised an eyebrow. "What do you mean?" She shrugged, taking a sip of her tea. "The Liam who didn't need someone else to feel whole. The Liam who didn't have to sacrifice every bit of himself to make someone else happy." She paused, glancing at me with that knowing look only a sister can give. "I didn't recognize you for a while there, you know? You seemed smaller, like you'd folded yourself up just to fit into a smaller space." Her words hit hard, sharper than I'd expected, because I knew she was right. I had shrunk myself, chipped away pieces, all to make Natalie feel secure, to avoid conflict, to keep things perfect. But perfection was a lie, and that small, folded-up version of myself was just a shadow of who I really was. I looked out over her yard, the quiet sounds of the evening settling around us. "I think I lost myself trying to keep her," I said, more to myself than to her. My sister put a hand on my shoulder, giving it a reassuring squeeze. "But you're here now," she said softly, "and that's all that matters." Those words settled something deep inside me. It was true, I was here now. I was stepping out of Natalie's shadow, and for the first time, I didn't feel the need to look back, to analyze what went wrong or how I could have saved it. I could see now that some things just weren't meant to be saved. Over the next few days, I made a conscious decision to let go, truly let go. I deleted every picture of us together, every old message and email, even her number from my phone. It wasn't an angry purge. It was a quiet, intentional step toward reclaiming my life. One evening, I took a drive to the edge of the city, up to a hill where you could see the whole skyline, lights twinkling like stars. Sitting there alone, watching the city stretch out before me, I felt something I hadn't felt in a long time, a deep, profound sense of peace. For the first time, I wasn't haunted by the past, wasn't weighed down by regrets or what-ifs. I was free. I realized then that I'd learned something invaluable through all of this. I'd learned how to be alone without being lonely, how to rebuild without needing someone else to make me feel whole. And maybe that was the one gift Natalie had given me. In the end, the freedom to rediscover myself, to reclaim the life I'd almost forgotten was mine. As I sat there, breathing in the cool night air, I felt a quiet gratitude for the journey, for the mistakes, for the lessons I never knew I needed. And with that realization, I closed the final chapter of that part of my life, ready to start something new, something that was truly, fully mine. Months passed, and with each one, the memories of my life with Natalie faded like a distant echo. I'd settled into my new normal, a routine that was completely my own. I spent my mornings running through the park, my evenings reconnecting with old friends, and my weekends exploring the city, discovering places I'd never taken the time to appreciate before. Every day felt lighter, freer, like I was finally steering my own life again. Then one Saturday, on a whim, I decided to try a pottery class. I'd been picking up small hobbies here and there. Photography, cooking, even a bit of carpentry, just trying things that felt like they were mine. Pottery was next on my list, and I figured it couldn't hurt to give it a shot. The studio was small, tucked away on a quiet street with big windows and rows of clay pieces on shelves, each one more unique than the last. I was late, typical me, and rushed into the class to find everyone already at their wheels, focused and quiet. The instructor, a middle-aged woman with a warm smile, waved me over to an empty spot near the back, next to a woman with curly hair pulled back into a messy bun. She glanced up as I settled in, giving me a quick, polite smile. "First time?" she asked, her tone light, friendly. I nodded, chuckling. "Is it that obvious?" She laughed, a genuine, easy laugh, and I found myself relaxing. "It always is," she said. "I'm Sarah." "Liam," I replied, reaching out to shake her clay-covered hand without even thinking. She grinned, raising her messy fingers with a laugh, and I realized my mistake, chuckling along with her. From there, we worked side by side, chatting as we fumbled through shaping the clay. Sarah had this easy energy, calm yet full of life, and it drew me in without effort. She had a way of laughing at her own mistakes that made me laugh too, a lightness that felt refreshing. We talked about everything from work to travel to the best pizza spots in the city, our conversation flowing like we'd known each other longer than a couple of hours. At the end of the class, our pieces were far from perfect, lopsided bowls, slightly wobbly edges, but there was something oddly satisfying about creating something with my own hands, something that didn't have to be flawless to feel meaningful. Sarah seemed to feel the same way, holding up her misshapen bowl with a proud grin. "Looks like a kindergarten project," she joked, setting it on the shelf to dry. "But I kind of love it." "Hey, it has character," I said, smiling. "Besides, if it's good enough to hold cereal, it's a success in my book." She laughed, and as we left the studio, she turned to me, hesitating for a moment before saying, "There's a cafe down the street that does an amazing hot chocolate. If you're not in a rush, I mean." I paused, surprised by the invitation but genuinely intrigued. "Lead the way." The cafe was cozy, filled with the warm smell of coffee and fresh pastries. We found a spot by the window, and as we sipped our drinks, the conversation shifted to deeper topics, the kind you don't expect to have with a stranger. Sarah shared stories about her work as a pediatric nurse, her passion for helping people, and the way she'd fallen into pottery as a way to unwind. I told her a bit about myself, carefully navigating around my past with Natalie, not because I was hiding it, but because it didn't feel relevant anymore. Felt good, talking to someone without any history weighing me down. As the afternoon melted into evening, I realized that I hadn't thought about Natalie once. For the first time, I was just there, fully present, enjoying the company of someone who was unapologetically herself. It was like breathing fresh air after being underwater for too long. At the end of the night, we exchanged numbers with an easy, mutual understanding, no pressure, no expectations. Just the possibility of a new connection, something that felt simple, refreshing, and real. Driving home, I felt an unfamiliar warmth, a quiet excitement that I hadn't felt in years. Meeting Sarah had reminded me that there was still life beyond the shadows of my past, that there were still people, experiences, and possibilities waiting out there that I hadn't even begun to explore. In that moment, I realized that the person I'd been before Natalie wasn't gone. He was still there, just waiting for the chance to breathe again. And now, finally, he had it. A few days after the pottery class, Sarah and I met up again. This time, it was at a local park where she claimed the sunsets were spectacular, a spot where she'd go to unwind after long shifts at the hospital. The air was cool, the sky washed with soft shades of pink and orange, and as we walked along the tree-lined paths, I felt that same ease around her that I had at the cafe. It was strange, realizing how quickly someone could feel familiar, like they'd slipped effortlessly into the space you didn't even know was empty. We talked about the little things at first, favorite places, embarrassing childhood stories, life's small and strange twists. But by the time the sun had dipped below the trees, our conversations had drifted toward things that mattered. The conversations where honesty feels more like a release than a risk. At one point, I found myself opening up about the last few months, about the hard truths I'd faced, and the parts of myself I was learning to reclaim. I told her that I'd been through a tough breakup, how it had made me reevaluate everything I thought I knew about myself and what I wanted. I expected her to react with sympathy or surprise, but she just nodded thoughtfully, a quiet understanding in her eyes. "I get it," she said softly. "Sometimes it takes something breaking to realize what's worth holding on to." That simple truth settled over me, deep and undeniable. She didn't ask for details, didn't probe for more than I was willing to share. She just listened, fully present, letting the silence between us feel as natural as the words. I felt safe in that silence, like I could be fully myself. Flaws, regrets, all of it, without fear or hesitation. As we walked back, I realized that I hadn't felt this open, this understood, in a long time. It wasn't that she was filling some void left by Natalie, or that I was trying to force a new beginning. It was more like she was showing me that the future could be filled with depth and kindness, that connections could be simple, genuine, and completely free of the baggage of the past. In the following weeks, Sarah and I grew closer. We met up often, sometimes for coffee, sometimes to try new things around the city, sometimes just to talk. She became my confidant, someone I could laugh with, confide in, and, slowly but surely, trust. There was no rush, no urgency. Just a steady, natural pace that felt more real than anything I'd experienced in years. One evening, after a quiet dinner at her place, she looked at me, a smile tugging at her lips. "You know," she said, her voice light but sincere, "I'm glad you took that pottery class." "Me too," I replied, returning her smile. "Guess we've got our lopsided bowls to thank." We laughed, but as our laughter faded, I felt something more. A quiet, growing certainty that I hadn't felt in a long time. I realized then that meeting her wasn't just a chance encounter. It was a reminder of what I was capable of how much life there was left to explore. As I left her place that night, I felt a warmth that wasn't just excitement. It was peace, a sense of being right where I was meant to be. I knew then that I was done looking back, done reliving the past. Whatever Natalie and I had shared was a closed chapter, a lesson learned. I was ready, fully and finally, to let the future unfold on its own terms. In the quiet drive home, I couldn't help but smile to myself. For the first time in a long time, my life felt whole, full of new possibilities. And as I thought of the life ahead, of all the moments yet to come, I knew one thing for certain. This was just the beginning.